So because Professor Wray represents the MMT school and I represent the Austrian school, I imagine a lot of this debate is going to center around our differing views on technical economics and what causes business cycles and so forth. But before I get into sort of the technical economics of it and our dispute there, let me first just sort of frame this and say that the fundamental reason that I support the proposition, namely a sound economy requires market-chosen money outside the control of government, isn't so much about technical economics, but rather more political philosophy. So let me read this quote to you folks from Ludwig von Mises. And here he's talking about the idea of sound money in the classical liberal tradition. So Mises says, "It is impossible to grasp the meaning of the idea of sound money if one does not realize that it was devised as an instrument for the protection of civil liberties against despotic inroads on the part of governments. Ideologically, it belongs in the same class with political constitutions and bills of rights. The demand for constitutional guarantees and for bills of rights was a reaction against arbitrary rule and the non-observance of old customs by kings. The postulate of sound money was first brought up as a response to the princely practice of debasing the coinage. It was later carefully elaborated and perfected in the age which had learned what a government can do to a nation's currency system." Okay, so what Mises is getting at there is saying that the idea of sound money, and by that Mises meant hard commodity money like gold and silver, and just let the market choose the money, and banks can issue notes and so forth tied to that, but the government stays out of it and it's market produced money. What Mises was saying there is that the reason the classical liberals favored that wasn't simply a matter of they had studied the economic literature and decided, we can have longer or higher long-term growth if we use a gold standard as opposed to paper fiat money. That wasn't the issue. The issue was more of how do you protect the public or the citizenry from having their wealth stolen by the king? And from just age immemorial, what had happened was the princes, when they had a war or they had other expenses, they would debase the coinage. And what did that mean? That means melting down the coins and then putting in a baser metal. Okay, and so that would cause inflation and so on. But the point was, how do you protect against that? They're saying keep the money away from politics, separation of money and state, as it were. And so likewise, I would ask you to think, just as we would want to have a free press, right? Like a sound society requires market-produced newspapers and so forth outside the control of government, right? We'd all agree with that. We wouldn't want the government controlling the news. We wouldn't want the government controlling science, right? A sound society requires science that's not politicized, that's independent from government interference. So likewise, just in that sense, the institution of money, clearly you'd want politics to stay away from that. How could you trust government officials with that sort of power? Okay, so what I want to say here is that, and I'm sure we're going to get into the arguments here, and I can respond more concretely once I hear exactly what Professor Wray is going to say to us. But even if he establishes in theory, government officials, if they handled themselves and conducted monetary policy according to the way he and other proponents of MMT would advise, and that would be the theoretically best of all worlds, I want to say that's not enough, right? That in practice, the issue is, if we give politicians control of the printing press, are they actually going to do the responsible thing? Just look at this upcoming election in the United States right now. Which side do you want to give the printing press to? The side of Donald Trump or the side of Joe Biden? I don't want to give it to either of those camps. Right? And I think it's very naive if Professor Wray tries to make this merely about the technical economics and to say, oh no, we can trust the government to get it right with fiat money as long as they did X, Y, and Z with it, which I'm imagining he's going to make a case for that. And again, I'll certainly be happy to, when I get to respond, point out why I think he's wrong, even in theory. But my point is, even if you thought that were up in the air or you even were convinced by him, that still doesn't establish the truth of the proposition that we're debating today. Another way of seeing this is that when you leave the choice of the money commodity up to free individuals in the marketplace, in a sense, it's more robust. Okay, so it's true. I think market-produced money, and by the way, let me just mention, the market produced money. Okay, it was free people who spontaneously, as it were, settled upon monies. Like money emerged spontaneously. It wasn't that a wise king invented money. And right now in these opening remarks, I don't have time to go into that history, but I do want to say the market is how money arose originally, and then it was the government process that came in and sort of co-opted it, and then eventually, pushed it out entirely, such that we now have the current system of government fiat money. But for example, and just in case you don't know the history, dollars, French francs, German marks, and so on, originally the reason people held those was because they were redeemable in either gold or silver, depending on the time period. And that's how people came to value those things. And it was only later that governments severed the link to the precious metals. Okay, so originally people used commodity money, and government produced money and then eventually fiat money was the later innovation, and I would say a bad one. Okay, so one way to see, I'm returning to my earlier point here, one way to understand the robustness of this is that by leaving it up to freedom, that let people choose, if something looks to be very risky, then people can get out of it. Okay, whereas if you're using government coercion to force a whole society to use a particular money, as long as the government technocrats do a good job, okay, maybe it's not that bad. Maybe even Professor Wray is going to try to argue it's better than what the anarchic market would have produced on its own. But my point here is, when it goes bad with government produced fiat money, it's awful. Namely, you get hyperinflation, the collapse of the currency. So say what you will about the gold standard, or even better, like just gold coins that are directly produced without any government involvement at all. And so that's just gold being the money, or silver, or whatever commodity you want. Or of course, for the fans of cryptocurrency, letting people, use whatever currencies they want, Bitcoin or the more recent innovations. Say what you will about those things, but you're not going to get something as catastrophic as the German hyperinflation between the two world wars, or what's happened in Zimbabwe, or what's happening in Venezuela, right? That stuff only happens, those mass, large-scale hyperinflations that just wipe out the middle class and lead to all sorts of social chaos and economic destruction. That sort of carnage can only happen when a government has arrogated to itself the decision, oh no, we know what's best, we're going to impose a money on the whole economy, and then they screw it up. They print way too much of it. So I grant that I'm sure Professor Wray is going to say how he has criteria so that we never get there with MMT. Fair enough. But my point is, you're always leaving that possibility open when you give government this tremendous power that no institution should have to dictate what money the whole society should be using. Now, even putting aside cases like the German hyperinflation or Zimbabwe, what have you, even if we talk about the United States, which is relatively responsible and has a decent track record as far as these things go, still, it's important to realize that the history of what happened under the Federal Reserve is abysmal. So let me just show you some statistics here. From 1879 to 1914, there was cumulatively virtually zero price inflation or deflation. Namely, something that cost $100 in 1879, in the year 1914, that bundle of goods would cost about $99.95. So there's actually a tiny little bit of price deflation over that long span. All right. Since the foundation of the Fed, of course, the dollar has lost, depending on which statistic you look at, something like 99% of its purchasing power. Okay. Perhaps a little bit less, depending on which price index you use, but still losing most of it over that history. Furthermore, it's not merely that price inflation is larger, it's also more volatile. Furthermore, real output is more volatile since the founding of the Fed. Consider this, the Great Depression and the Great Recession, the two worst economic calamities, happened on the Fed's watch. So I could ask, what more would have to happen for people to realize that the creation of a central bank, far from providing monetary stability and steady and smooth economic growth to avoid the wild ups and downs that allegedly would happen under a free market, clearly the Federal Reserve fails on all those counts, and this is using objective economic measures. All right. Last thing I'll mention here is, in the Austrian tradition, the cause of business cycles is monetary inflation pushes interest rates down to an artificially low level that stimulates a false boom, an unsustainable boom that leads to a bust. It's the only way to get rid of this boom bust cycle is to take money in banking and give it back to the private sector. Thank you.